When Spanish soldiers under Hernán Cortés first glimpsed Tenochtitlan in November 1519, several among them genuinely questioned whether what they were seeing could possibly be real. They compared the city's scale and sophistication to scenes from popular chivalric fiction, rather than anything they had previously encountered in the Spanish colonial world. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, was built on an island within Lake Texcoco, in the Valley of Mexico, connected to the mainland through engineered causeways. This represented a genuinely remarkable feat of urban engineering and planning, considered among the most sophisticated achievements of the entire ancient Americas. Founded in 1325, Tenochtitlan grew across 2 centuries into one of the largest cities in the world, with population estimates ranging from 100,000 to 200,000. A population that likely exceeded that of contemporary European capitals, including London or Paris during this same general historical period. The city's sophisticated infrastructure included an extensive canal system for transportation and a carefully engineered aqueduct system providing fresh water from mainland springs. Notably, advanced agricultural technology, including chinampas, artificial floating islands, allowed intensive food production supporting the substantial urban population. At the city's ceremonial center stood the Templo Mayor, a massive stepped pyramid temple complex dedicated to 2 significant Aztec deities. Surrounded by temples and the royal palace, Spanish observers described the marketplace as larger and more organized than any market they had encountered in Europe, offering an extraordinary range of goods drawn from across the empire's considerable tributary territory. The Aztec Empire represented a significant political and military power across central Mexico by the time of Spanish contact. Understanding its structure requires moving beyond oversimplified conceptions of a single unified empire, comparable to European models of the same period. The empire functioned primarily through a hegemonic tribute system centered around Tenochtitlan and the allied cities of the Triple Alliance. They extended military and political dominance across numerous subordinate city-states throughout the broader region. Subordinate polities maintained local political autonomy and their own rulers, provided they submitted regular tribute payments. They were also required to acknowledge Aztec military and political supremacy in all regional matters. This tribute-based system was effective in generating wealth and resources that supported Tenochtitlan's continued growth and development. However, it also created significant political tension, as many neighboring peoples harbored resentment toward the heavy tribute demands. In some cases, there was an additional demand for captives intended for religious sacrifice, a practice addressed later in this documentary. This underlying political tension would prove significant to the empire's eventual fall. Spanish forces under Cortés ultimately succeeded in recruiting substantial military support from indigenous peoples like the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans maintained a long-standing political and military rivalry with the Aztec Empire and its Triple Alliance partners. This reflects a complex historical reality beyond a simple Spanish military conquest of a unified indigenous opposition. The empire's economic foundation rested on this tribute system, with territories providing goods like agricultural produce and textiles. Resources like gold, jade, and elaborate feathers flowed continuously into Tenochtitlan. These materials supported the large population and the ruler's ability to sponsor monumental religious and civic construction projects. This fueled a century-long period of continuous territorial expansion and consolidation across the Mesoamerican world. Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican coast in early 1519, leading a Spanish expedition that comprised a genuinely modest force by European military standards. Numbering several hundred Spanish soldiers, this campaign faced a substantial numerical disadvantage against the Aztec Empire's considerably larger available military forces. Cortés's expedition proceeded inland toward Tenochtitlan through a combination of military engagement and, significantly, diplomatic negotiation. They successfully formed crucial military alliances with several indigenous groups, harboring grievances against Aztec dominance, most notably the Tlaxcalans. whose substantial military support would prove genuinely decisive throughout the subsequent campaign. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II's response to the Spanish expedition remains a subject of genuine historical debate among scholars today. Historical accounts describe Moctezuma's approach as ranging from cautious diplomatic engagement to possible religious uncertainty regarding the visitor's identity. Modern historians treat the most dramatic versions of this narrative, including claims regarding Moctezuma believing Cortés was a returning deity, with considerable caution. Cortés and his forces, accompanied by their indigenous allies, entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519, initially received by Moctezuma in a formally hospitable diplomatic reception, before the relationship between the two groups deteriorated significantly. Spanish accounts describe considerable initial amazement among the soldiers upon encountering Tenochtitlan's impressive urban infrastructure. Several soldiers explicitly compared the city's material wealth and royal accommodations to the most impressive cities they had personally witnessed in Europe. This reflects genuine Spanish recognition of Aztec civilization's sophistication, even amid the conquest narrative that would soon follow. Within a short time following their initial arrival, Cortés's forces effectively took Moctezuma into custody, maintaining him under close Spanish supervision. They continued to govern through him as a compromised ruling authority, reflecting the precarious and tense political circumstances developing within the city. This situation deteriorated further when Spanish forces under Pedro de Alvarado attacked Aztec nobles participating in a significant religious festival. The incident triggered immediate, widespread Aztec public outrage and subsequent open military resistance against the Spanish presence within Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma himself died during this escalating conflict, with historical accounts offering varying, sometimes conflicting explanations regarding the specific circumstances of his death. Spanish accounts suggest he was killed by his own people, while alternative indigenous accounts suggest more direct Spanish responsibility. Facing this dangerous situation, Cortés's forces attempted a nighttime withdrawal from Tenochtitlan, an episode termed La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night. Spanish and Allied forces suffered severe casualties while attempting to escape the city via its causeways under direct sustained Aztec military attack. Following their costly withdrawal from Tenochtitlan, Cortés's forces retreated to regroup among their Tlaxcalan allies, while a genuinely significant, historically consequential development was already unfolding within the city and broader region, entirely independent of any direct Spanish military action. The spread of smallpox, a European disease, against which indigenous American populations possessed no prior immunity whatsoever. Smallpox had reportedly spread to the region through contact with Spanish forces arriving from Cuba, and its subsequent transmission throughout the densely populated Valley of Mexico produced genuinely catastrophic mortality. With historical and epidemiological analysis suggesting the disease may have killed a substantial percentage of Tenochtitlan's population, including, significantly, the Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had assumed leadership following Moctezuma's death, but who himself died from smallpox after a reign of only a few months. Historians studying the broader Spanish conquest of the Americas consistently emphasize that European disease, rather than direct military conquest alone, likely represents the single most significant factor in the catastrophic overall demographic collapse indigenous American populations experienced following European contact, with estimates suggesting disease may have killed a considerably larger proportion of the pre-contact indigenous population across the broader Americas than direct military conflict, a historical reality this documentary considers essential to state clearly, rather than presenting the conquest primarily as a straightforward military narrative alone. This devastating epidemic significantly weakened Tenochtitlan's capacity for continued organized resistance. During the crucial period before Cortés's eventual return, with reinforced Spanish and significantly, substantially expanded indigenous allied military forces, representing a genuinely tragic historical circumstance in which disease, entirely independent of direct battlefield engagement, fundamentally altered the military and political balance of the unfolding conflict. Modern historians studying this epidemic's specific demographic impact rely on a combination of Spanish and indigenous historical accounts, alongside more recent archaeological and epidemiological analysis, generally concluding smallpox's introduction represented a genuinely unprecedented biological catastrophe for populations possessing no prior immunological exposure to this specific disease. A pattern historians note repeated across numerous subsequent instances of European contact with previously isolated indigenous American populations throughout the broader colonial period, extending well beyond this particular initial documented outbreak. Following his forces regrouping and the arrival of additional reinforcements, along with a substantially expanded indigenous allied military coalition that included forces considerably outnumbering Cortés's original Spanish contingent, Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico in 1521, initiating an extended, brutal siege of Tenochtitlan, lasting approximately 3 months. Cortés's forces employed a methodical siege strategy, including constructing specialized small ships called brigantines to control Lake Texcoco's waters, systematically cutting off the city's crucial causeway access points, and gradually destroying portions of the city's infrastructure, as Spanish and Allied forces slowly advanced through Tenochtitlan's urban districts during the siege's extended final months. The city's Aztec defenders, under the leadership of Cuauhtémoc, who had assumed imperial authority following Cuitlahuac's death from smallpox, mounted sustained resistance throughout this siege, with historical accounts describing intense urban combat as forces gradually pushed through the city's districts. This extended siege inflicted severe suffering on Tenochtitlan's civilian population, with historical accounts describing significant famine and continued disease mortality. Reflecting the devastating human cost this 3-month siege imposed, already significantly weakened by the smallpox epidemic that had preceded the military commencement. The scale of the indigenous allied forces supporting Cortés during this final siege phase deserves particular emphasis, with historical estimates suggesting these allied forces likely numbered in the tens of thousands, considerably exceeding the relatively modest Spanish military contingent. This conflict involved substantial indigenous political agency and military participation, extending well beyond a simple narrative of Spanish forces alone conquering Aztec civilization. Tenochtitlan finally fell to Spanish and allied indigenous forces in August 1521, with Cuauhtémoc himself captured while attempting to escape the city, marking the definitive military conclusion to the siege and the effective end of independent Aztec imperial political authority. Historical accounts describe the city's final capture as involving genuinely severe destruction and civilian casualties, with the once magnificent capital left substantially devastated following the siege's brutal final phase, a stark contrast to the scale and sophistication that had amazed Spanish observers less than 2 years earlier. Cuauhtémoc's subsequent treatment under Spanish custody involved genuine historical controversy, including documented accounts of torture inflicted to extract information regarding the location of additional Aztec treasure, before his eventual execution several years later during a subsequent Spanish expedition. These episodes address the genuine human cost this conquest imposed on the Aztec civilization's final leadership. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of an era, though Spanish control required decades of continued military campaigns. This consolidation eventually characterized the established colonial administration across the region known as New Spain. Despite Tenochtitlan's genuine, devastating destruction, significant elements of Aztec and broader Nahua indigenous culture, language, and religious tradition demonstrated meaningful continuity. Throughout the subsequent Spanish colonial period, a historical reality that responsible historical treatment should acknowledge alongside the genuine, severe disruption and loss the conquest inflicted. The Nahuatl language spoken by the Aztec and related indigenous peoples continued as a widely spoken language throughout the subsequent colonial period, and remains spoken by several million people in modern Mexico today, representing genuine linguistic continuity, extending directly into contemporary Mexican society and culture. Spanish colonial authorities, notably including several dedicated Franciscan and other religious scholars, undertook significant efforts to document indigenous Aztec history, culture, and religious practice, producing several genuinely significant surviving historical sources, including notably the extensive work compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún, working directly with indigenous informants, to document pre-conquest Aztec culture in detail, providing modern historians with invaluable insight into a civilization that would otherwise have been considerably more limited. Modern Mexico City itself was constructed substantially atop Tenochtitlan's original site, with ongoing archaeological excavation, particularly significant work conducted at the Templo Mayor, Tenochtitlan's primary religious temple complex, continuing to reveal genuinely valuable physical evidence regarding Aztec civilization, religious practice, and daily life, providing historians with an increasingly detailed, evidence-based understanding of this remarkable pre-Columbian civilization, extending well beyond what documentary sources alone could provide. Historical understanding of Tenochtitlan's fall has evolved considerably in recent decades, with historians increasingly emphasizing the importance of incorporating indigenous historical perspectives. This shifts focus away from the traditionally more heavily relied upon Spanish colonial accounts that dominated earlier historical scholarship regarding this significant historical period. Surviving indigenous historical accounts, including several significant Nahuatl language sources produced in the decades following the conquest, provide historians with genuinely valuable alternative perspectives. These sources reveal considerably more complex indigenous political motivations, experiences, and interpretations than the traditional Spanish-centered conquest narrative alone typically conveys. This includes genuine indigenous agency and strategic political calculation among the numerous indigenous groups who allied with Spanish forces against Aztec imperial dominance. This more historically complete understanding emphasizes that the conquest should not be understood simply as a straightforward binary conflict between Spanish conquerors and unified indigenous resistance. Instead, it was a complex event involving substantial indigenous political agency, existing regional political rivalries, and grievances predating the arrival of the Spanish. Significantly, the devastating, largely independent impact of European disease fundamentally shaped the conflict's outcome in ways extending well beyond direct military engagement alone. This nuanced understanding does not diminish the severe human cost and cultural disruption the conquest inflicted upon Aztec civilization and the broader indigenous population. It offers more historically accurate insight into the event's actual underlying causation and unfolding, beyond simplified narratives of purely Spanish military conquest. Contemporary Mexican historical and cultural identity continues actively engaging with this complex history, with modern scholarship and museum curation working to present the genuine complexity. Recognizing both the remarkable pre-conquest indigenous civilization and the significant lasting historical consequences the conquest period produced for the subsequent development of Mexican society. Nearly 5 centuries after Tenochtitlan's fall, this remarkable pre-Columbian American capital continues receiving increasingly serious, evidence-based historical and archaeological attention, with modern scholarship working to present this genuinely significant historical event with the full complexity and multiple perspectives it deserves, moving well beyond earlier historical treatments that frequently presented the conquest through an uncritical, purely Spanish colonial perspective alone. Understanding Tenochtitlan's fall accurately requires holding multiple genuine historical truths simultaneously. Appreciating the remarkable urban engineering, political organization, and cultural achievement Tenochtitlan represented as one of the world's most significant cities, while also honestly acknowledging the genuine severe human cost, cultural disruption, and demographic catastrophe, driven substantially by disease as much as direct military conquest, that the conquest period inflicted upon Aztec civilization. This historical complexity extends well beyond Tenochtitlan's own circumstances, offering insight into the tragic processes through which European colonial expansion encountered indigenous civilizations, processes whose full historical complexity continues receiving increasingly serious, nuanced scholarly attention, extending well beyond simplified historical narratives. Beneath modern Mexico City's streets, the remnants of Tenochtitlan's temples, canals, and causeways remain, gradually continuing to reveal themselves through ongoing archaeological investigation. Physical evidence of a remarkably resilient civilization whose fall offers essential historical insight, extending well beyond any single simplified narrative of conquest alone.